Sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one who's finally found something worth protecting. Every person deserves a second chance at love, even when that person is Augustus Gus Ironwood, the feared gunslinger they call the Giant Cowboy. In 1877 New Mexico, Gus has hung up his guns and married Patience Mae, the preacher's daughter. For 30 years men feared his name. His hands ended more lives than anyone cared to count. But now those same hands hold his young bride with the gentleness of a man who knows what it's like to lose everything. The folks in Larkspur Ridge watch in wonder as this mountain of a man walks beside his wife like she's made of fine china. He's traded his reputation for a chance at redemption. But can a legendary killer truly leave his past buried in the desert sand? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Larkspur Ridge, painting the adobe buildings in shades of gold and amber that reminded Augustus Ironwood of better times. He stood on the narrow porch of the modest home he now shared with his wife, watching the town come alive with the quiet rhythm of decent folks going about their daily business. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd spent 3 decades avoiding civilization had found his peace in the heart of a community that valued nothing more than neighborly kindness and Sunday worship. Gus stretched his massive frame, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulders where an Apache arrow had found its mark 15 years prior. At 52, he carried the weight of his years in every movement, but there was something different now in the way he held himself. Gone was the predatory stillness that had made lesser men reach for their weapons just by being in his presence. In its place sat a careful restraint, the posture of a man learning to move through the world without leaving a trail of fear in his wake. "Coffee's ready," came the gentle voice from inside, and Gus felt that familiar warmth spread through his chest, the same feeling he got every morning when he remembered he wasn't waking up alone anymore. Patience Mae appeared in the doorway, her auburn hair catching the early light as she balanced a steaming cup in her delicate hands. At 26, she possessed the kind of beauty that didn't announce itself with flourish, but revealed itself slowly, like sunrise over the desert. Her green eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom beyond her years, and when she looked at him, Gus sometimes forgot he was a man with blood on his hands. "Thank you, darling," he said, accepting the coffee with the same reverence another man might reserve for Holy Communion. His fingers, scarred and weathered from years of quick draws and hard living, wrapped around the simple ceramic mug with infinite care. Everything about Patience required this gentleness, not because she was fragile, but because she was precious in a way that made him want to handle her like spun glass. She settled beside him on the wooden bench he'd built during their first week as husband and wife, her shoulder barely reaching his elbow even when they were both sitting. The size difference between them had been the subject of considerable gossip when they'd married 3 months ago, though Gus suspected it wasn't just their physical mismatch that had set tongues wagging. "Mrs. Henderson was asking about you yesterday," Patience said, her tone carefully neutral in the way that told him there was more to the story. "And what did Mrs. Henderson have to say?" Gus asked, though he could guess. Margaret Henderson ran the general store with the efficiency of a cavalry sergeant and the discretion of a town crier. If there was gossip to be spread in Larkspur Ridge, it generally started behind her counter. She wondered if you might help her husband repair their barn roof. "Seems a windstorm took off some shingles last week." Patience sipped her coffee, studying his profile. "I told her you'd be happy to lend a hand." Gus nodded, understanding the unspoken currents beneath the simple request. Tom Henderson was a decent man who'd never shown him anything but polite respect. But Margaret still looked at Gus like she expected him to start shooting up the place at any moment. Having him work on their property would be her way of testing whether the reformed gunfighter could be trusted with something as mundane as roofing repairs. "I'll stop by after breakfast," he said, "though I suspect she'll want to watch me work from a safe distance." "Give her time," Patience said, reaching over to squeeze his forearm. "Change doesn't happen overnight, especially when people have heard stories." The stories. Gus took a long drink of coffee, letting the bitter warmth settle in his stomach along with the familiar weight of his reputation. They followed him everywhere, tales of the Giant Cowboy, who could outdraw any man west of the Mississippi, who'd killed 17 men in fair fights, and probably twice that number in situations that weren't quite so honorable. Some of the stories were true. Others had grown in the telling until they bore little resemblance to reality. All of them served as a barrier between him and the kind of ordinary life he'd never thought he wanted. "Your father's been asking about the church social next week," Gus said, changing the subject to safer ground. "Wants to know if we'll help with the preparations." Patience's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "I was hoping you'd agree. It's been too long since you've spent time with the congregation outside of Sunday service." Reverend May had been surprisingly accepting of his daughter's choice in husbands, though Gus suspected the man's Christian charity was being sorely tested by the arrangement. Still, Thomas had performed their wedding ceremony with dignity, and had never once suggested that Patience had made a mistake. For that alone, Gus would have walked through fire for the older man. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the street, where old Pete Carruthers was making his daily trip to the post office. Pete nodded in their direction, a slight acknowledgement that represented significant progress from the man's initial reaction to having a notorious gunfighter living in his quiet town. "Morning, Pete," Gus called out, raising his coffee cup in greeting. "Morning, Gus, Mrs. Ironwood." Pete touched the brim of his hat to Patience before continuing on his way. But there was something different in his posture, less of the rigid tension that had characterized their early interactions inside their small home. Gus's retired gun belt hung on a wooden peg by the door, the leather worn smooth from years of use. The Colt .45 it once carried now rested in a locked box beneath their bed, wrapped in oilcloth and buried under Patience's winter quilts. He'd considered getting rid of the weapon entirely, but some instincts died hard. A man didn't survive 30 years in his profession by being careless about such things. "I should get started on the Henderson job," Gus said, finishing his coffee, and standing to his full height of 6 feet and 6 inches. Even in his stocking feet, he towered over most men, and the breadth of his shoulders had always made doorways seem like tight squeezes. Patience stood as well, smoothing down the simple blue dress she wore for daily chores. "I'll pack you something to eat. You know how Margaret gets when people work through lunch." As she disappeared inside to prepare food, Gus allowed himself a moment to appreciate the simple domestic tranquility of the scene. 3 months ago, he'd been sleeping under the stars more often than not, taking whatever jobs kept him moving and staying ahead of the law. Now he had a wife who worried about his lunch and neighbors who trusted him with their property repairs. The transformation should have felt more complete than it did. Through their bedroom window, he could see the small trunk where Patience kept her most precious belongings, including the letters his reputation had generated before their marriage. Some were from concerned church members, questioning the wisdom of the Reverend's daughter marrying a known killer. Others were from bounty hunters and rival gunfighters, who saw his retirement as either an opportunity or a challenge. Patience had shown him the letters during their engagement, insisting they have no secrets between them. Her calm acceptance of the dangers that came with loving him had been both humbling and terrifying. She understood that marrying Augustus Ironwood meant accepting that his past would always be lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to resurface. "Here you are," she said, emerging with a cloth-wrapped bundle that smelled of fresh bread and ham. "And don't work too hard in this heat. It's going to be another scorcher." He accepted the lunch with a kiss to her forehead, breathing in the scent of lavender soap that always seemed to cling to her hair. "I'll be careful. Henderson's not the type to push a man past his limits." "It's not Tom I'm worried about," she said with a knowing smile. As Gus walked toward town, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step, he found himself cataloguing the changes in how people reacted to his presence. Mrs. Chen, who ran the boarding house, no longer crossed herself when she saw him coming. Young Billy Morrison had even worked up the courage to ask him about horses last week, though the boy's mother had quickly pulled him away when the conversation started getting animated. The Henderson property sat on the eastern edge of town, close enough to be considered civilized, but far enough out to offer some privacy. Tom Henderson was waiting for him in the shade of a cottonwood tree, a tall ladder propped against the side of their modest two-story home. "Appreciate you coming out, Gus," Tom said, extending a work-roughened hand. "Margaret's been fretting about those shingles since the storm. Thinks the whole roof's going to blow away if we don't get them fixed." "Happy to help," Gus replied, accepting the handshake and noting that Tom's grip was firm without being challenging. The handshake of a man who'd decided to judge him on present actions rather than past reputation. They spent the morning working in companionable silence, with Tom holding the ladder steady while Gus carefully replaced the damaged shingles. The work was honest and straightforward, requiring nothing more than steady hands and attention to detail. For a man accustomed to life and death decisions made in the span of a heartbeat, there was something profoundly peaceful about the methodical process of home repair. "You've got a good hand for this kind of work," Tom observed during their midday break, accepting half of Patience's sandwiches when Gus offered to share. "Spent some time doing carpentry up in Colorado before I took to the gun," Gus admitted. "Always liked working with my hands when it didn't involve violence." Tom nodded thoughtfully, chewing his sandwich and studying Gus with the careful attention of a man reassessing his assumptions. "Takes a brave woman to marry into the kind of life Patience chose. Takes a braver man to deserve her choice," Gus replied. "I'm still working on that part." By late afternoon they'd completed the repairs, and Margaret Henderson had emerged from the house to inspect their work. She maintained her distance, but offered grudging approval of the job they'd done. As Gus gathered his tools, he caught her watching him with something that might have been curiosity rather than fear. Walking home as the sun began to set, Gus reflected on the small victory the day represented. One more neighbor who might be willing to see him as something other than a walking threat. One more step toward the kind of ordinary life he'd never imagined wanting. But as he approached their house, he noticed something that made his old instincts prickle with warning. There were fresh horse tracks in the dirt outside their gate, tracks from an animal that hadn't been shod by the local blacksmith. Someone had been watching their home while he was away. Patience was waiting on the porch, her expression carefully composed, but her hands folded tightly in her lap. "How did the work go?" she asked, but there was tension in her voice that hadn't been there that morning. "Just fine," Gus said, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of the rider who'd left those tracks. "Everything quiet here?" "Mostly," she said, and he knew there was more to the story. As they went inside for supper, Gus made a mental note to be more careful about the signals he'd been ignoring. The peaceful life he was building with Patience was precious beyond measure, but it was also fragile in ways that had nothing to do with their size difference or the town's gradual acceptance. Some shadows from his past were longer and darker than others, and eventually they would all have to be faced. The stranger rode into Larkspur Ridge 3 days later, just as the church bells were calling the faithful to Wednesday evening prayer. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man comfortable with violence, his duster coat dusty from hard travel and his hat pulled low enough to shadow his features. But it wasn't his appearance that set Gus's teeth on edge. It was the way the man's eyes swept the street with the methodical precision of someone taking inventory. Gus was helping Patience tend her small garden behind their house when he heard The unfamiliar hoofbeats, slow to a stop in front of Henderson's general store. Something in the rhythm of those steps made him straighten, his hands instinctively wiping clean on the work pants Patience had sewn for him. Old habits died hard, and the habit of recognizing danger was older than most. "What is it?" Patience asked, noting the subtle change in his posture. "Probably nothing," Gus said. But he was already moving toward the front of their property, drawn by an instinct that had kept him alive through 3 decades of dangerous living. The stranger had dismounted and was tying his horse to the hitching, imposed with movements that spoke of countless repetitions. Even from a distance, Gus could see the worn grip of a revolver riding low on the man's hip. Not the working gun of a rancher or lawman, but the specialized weapon of someone who made his living with it. "Afternoon," the stranger called out to Margaret Henderson, who had emerged from her store with the wary expression of a woman who'd learned to be cautious around unfamiliar men. "Wondering if you might have seen a particular fellow passing through. Big man goes by the name of Augustus Ironwood. Some folks call him the Giant Cowboy." Gus felt the familiar chill that came with hearing his reputation spoken aloud in his new home. From their garden, Patience had gone perfectly still, her hands frozen over the tomato plants she'd been weeding. "Can't say I have," Margaret replied. But her eyes flicked involuntarily toward Gus's house, a movement so brief it might have escaped notice from anyone less experienced in reading people's tells. The stranger caught it anyway. "That's so," he said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who enjoyed drawing out conversations that made other people nervous. "Heard tell he might have settled down somewhere around here. Maybe taken himself a wife. If the stories are true." Margaret's face went pale, and Gus could see her struggling with the competing desires to protect her community and avoid bringing trouble down on herself. "Like I said, can't help you." The stranger nodded as if he'd expected no other answer, but his gaze was already shifting to survey the houses visible from the main street. When his eyes settled on Gus's modest home, they lingered with the satisfied expression of a man who'd found what he was looking for. "Much obliged, ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim with mock courtesy. "Think I'll get myself a room for the night? Maybe look around town a bit? Pretty little place you got here." As the stranger led his horse toward the boarding house, Gus made his decision. Whatever this man wanted, it was better to face it directly than let him go sniffing around the edges of their life together. "Stay in the garden," he told Patience, his voice carrying the quiet authority he'd once used to command respect in places where respect was measured in heartbeats. "I'll be back shortly." "Gus," she started, but he was already walking toward town with the measured stride of a man who knew exactly what kind of conversation he was about to have. The stranger was just finishing his arrangements with Mrs. Chen when Gus pushed through the boarding house door. Up close, he could see that the man was younger than his cautious movements suggested, maybe 35, with the kind of lean build that came from living hard and traveling light. His eyes were the pale gray of winter sky, and they held the flat steadiness that Gus recognized from looking in mirrors during his own violent years. "You asking about me?" Gus said without preamble. The stranger turned slowly, letting his gaze travel up Gus's considerable height before meeting his eyes. With a slight smile, "Well, I'll be damned. The Giant Cowboy himself. Got to say, the stories don't do you justice." "Stories have a way of growing in the telling," Gus replied. "What brings you to Larkspur Ridge?" "Name's Frank Dalton," the stranger said, extending a hand that Gus didn't take. "And I'm here on account of a piece of paper that's got your likeness on it and a number that caught my attention." From inside his coat, Dalton produced a folded wanted poster, its edges worn from handling and travel. He unfolded it with the theatrical precision of a man who enjoyed dramatic reveals, revealing Gus's face rendered in stark black ink above the words "Wanted Dead or Alive" and a reward sum that made Mrs. Chen gasp audibly. The poster was old, at least 5 years, judging by the artistic style, but the face staring back at Gus was unmistakably his own. Younger, harder, with the kind of dead eyes that belonged to a man who'd stopped counting his kills. Below the image, a list of charges read like a catalogue of frontier violence: murder, armed robbery, assault, disturbing the peace, and half a dozen others. "That's a lot of money for one man," Dalton observed, refolding the poster with care. "Course, most folks figure you're either dead or gone to Mexico by now. Me, I had a feeling you might be the settling down type. Something about the way you handled that business in Abilene suggested a man getting tired of the life." Gus kept his expression neutral, but inside he was calculating distances and angles, weighing options the way he'd been trained to do when violence was the most likely outcome. "That poster's older than my marriage. Whatever bounty was on my head, it's cold by now." "See, that's where you're wrong," Dalton said, his smile widening. "Bounty's actually gone up. Seems some influential folks back east got long memories about what happened to their boy in that Denver saloon. Added another 1,000 to the pot just last month." The mention of Denver hit Gus like a physical blow. He'd tried to forget that particular killing. A rich man's son who'd thought his father's money made him bulletproof until Gus proved otherwise. It had been a fair fight by frontier standards, but apparently fairness didn't matter much when the deceased came from railroad. "Money. So what's your play here, Dalton?" Gus asked. "You planning to take me in the middle of town with decent folks looking on?" "Nothing so crude," Dalton replied, tucking the poster back inside his coat. "I'm what you might call a civilized bounty hunter. I believe in giving a man options. You can come with me peaceful-like, and we'll ride out of here without any fuss. Nobody in your pretty little town needs to get hurt. And if I decline your generous offer," Dalton's smile took on a predatory edge, "well, then things get complicated. See, I brought some associates with me. They're camped about a mile outside town, waiting for my signal. If I don't show up by sundown tomorrow, they'll assume you killed me and act accordingly." The threat was clear enough. Gus could handle one bounty hunter, but multiple men with nothing to lose would turn Larkspur Ridge into a battleground. Innocent people would die, and the peaceful life he'd built with Patience would be destroyed either way. "You're putting me in a difficult position," Gus said. "I'm giving you a way out that doesn't end with your wife becoming a widow," Dalton corrected. "That's more consideration than most men in your position get." Through the boarding house window, Gus could see Margaret Henderson hurrying across the street toward his house, no doubt to warn Patience about the stranger's questions. Soon the whole town would know that his past had caught up with him, and the careful progress he'd made toward acceptance would crumble like a house built on sand. "I need time to think about it," Gus said finally. "Fair enough," Dalton agreed. "You've got until tomorrow at sunset. After that, my boys get restless, and restless men make poor decisions." As Gus walked back toward home, he could feel eyes watching from windows and doorways. Word was already spreading, the way it always did in small communities. By morning, everyone would know that the Giant Cowboy's violent past had come calling, and they'd all be wondering if their quiet little town was about to become another casualty of frontier justice. Patience was waiting on their porch, her face pale but composed. Margaret Henderson stood beside her, wringing her hands and shooting nervous glances toward the boarding house. "He showed me a poster," Gus said without preamble. "Old charges, but the bounty's still good." Patience nodded, her green eyes reflecting. The kind of steady courage that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. "What did you tell him?" "That I needed time to think." "And what are you thinking?" Gus looked at the small home they'd made together, at the garden where they'd spent peaceful mornings, at the town where he'd begun to hope for something better than a violent death in a dusty street. Then he looked at his wife, who deserved better than to live in fear of his past. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that some choices aren't really choices at all. The wanted poster in Frank Dalton's coat might be old and faded, but the threat it represented was as real as the gun on the bounty hunter's hip, and tomorrow at sunset, Gus would have to decide whether love was worth fighting for or worth walking away from. The night brought no sleep for either of them. Gus sat at their small kitchen table, his massive hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, while Patience moved quietly about their home, packing a small bag with the careful precision of a woman preparing for uncertain times ahead. "You don't have to do that," he said, when she folded one of his spare shirts into the traveling pack. "Yes, I do," she replied without looking up from her task. "Because wherever you go, I'm going with you." The words hit him harder than any physical blow he'd ever taken. In all his years of violence and wandering, no one had ever been willing to sacrifice their own safety for his. The idea that Patience would abandon the only home she'd ever known, the community that had watched her grow up, simply to stay by his side, it was both humbling and terrifying. "Patience, darling, this isn't your fight," he said, rising from the table to place his hands on her shoulders. Dalton made his intentions clear. "If I leave with him, you'll be safe. The town will be safe." She turned in his arms, her green eyes blazing with a determination that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her fierce spirit. "And what happens to you? Do you think I could live with myself knowing I let you walk away to face whatever's waiting at the end of that bounty?" From her apron pocket, she pulled out her worn leather Bible, its pages soft from years of handling and its margins filled with pressed flowers and handwritten notes. The book fell open naturally to the Book of Ruth, where she'd underlined a passage in fading ink: "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. I made vows, Augustus Ironwood," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "For better or worse, in sickness and in health. Those weren't just pretty words I spoke in front of my father and God." He wanted to argue with her, to explain all the reasons why loving him was dangerous, and why she'd be better off letting him disappear into the desert night. But the sight of that Bible, with its evidence of her deep faith and deeper commitment, stole the words from his throat. "There might be another way," he said finally, "but it would mean staying and fighting, and that could bring violence to people who don't deserve it. The people of this town aren't children, Gus. They knew what your past looked like when they decided to accept you, some of them anyway." She closed the Bible and held it against her chest like a shield. "And my father didn't raise me to run from difficult situations." As if summoned by her words, a soft knock came at their front door. Gus instinctively moved to place himself between Patience and whatever threat might be waiting outside, but when he opened the door, he found Tom Henderson standing on their porch with his hat in his hands. "Evening, Gus, Mrs. Ironwood," Tom said, his voice carrying the careful formality of a man who'd rehearsed what he was going to say. "Heard there might be some trouble heading our way." "Tom, you shouldn't be here," Gus said, glancing past the man to see if anyone else was watching. "This doesn't concern you or your family." "See, that's where you're wrong," Tom replied, stepping inside when Patience gestured for him to enter. "Way I figure it, a man helps his neighbors when they're in need. You helped me with my roof just yesterday. Today seems like you're the one who might need help." Behind Tom, two more figures emerged from the shadows of the street. Jim Carruthers, the blacksmith, and his son Pete, both carrying rifles and wearing the grim expressions of men who'd made up their minds about something important. "Word's already spread about the bounty hunter," Jim said without preamble. "Most folks are scared, I won't lie to you. But some of us remember that you could have ridden on through town 3 months ago and kept going. Instead, you stayed. You married into our community. You fixed our roofs and helped with our harvests." Pete nodded his agreement, though Gus could see the young man's hands trembling slightly on his rifle stock. "My PA says a man's judged by what he does today, not what he did yesterday. You've been nothing but decent to us, Gus." "Seems only right. We return the favor." Patience moved to stand beside her husband, her hand finding his arm as she addressed their unexpected visitors. "This is very generous of you, but you don't understand what you're offering to face. The man who came today isn't alone. He has associates waiting outside town." "How many?" Jim asked, his tone suggesting the number wouldn't change his mind. "He didn't say." Gus admitted, but bounty hunters like Dalton don't work alone unless they're confident they can handle whatever they find. My guess is he's got at least 3 or 4 men with him. Tom whistled low under his breath. That's a lot of guns. It is, Gus agreed, which is why I'm thinking it might be better if I just rode out with him. No sense in good people dying over my past mistakes. But then what? Pete asked, his young voice cracking slightly with nervousness and determination. You think this Dalton fellow is the only one who knows where to find you? You ride out of here tonight, and next month it'll be someone else, then someone else. After that, the young man's words carried an uncomfortable truth. Gus had been running from his reputation for years, always staying one step ahead of the law and the men who wanted to collect on his head. But settling down in Larkspur Ridge had changed the equation. Now he had something to lose, something worth protecting. What are you proposing? Patience, asked the men. We stand together, Jim said simply. Dalton wants a fight. We give him one. But on our terms, in our town, with our people. That's assuming the rest of the community agrees, Gus pointed out. Margaret Henderson looked ready to faint when she saw that wanted poster. There are families here. Children. They didn't sign up for a war. We'll talk to them, Tom said. Explain the situation. Let people decide for themselves. But I'm thinking, you might be surprised by how many folks are willing to stand with you. As the men talked strategy in quiet voices, Patience pulled Gus aside to the small alcove where they kept their coats and her father's old walking stick. What does your heart tell you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gus looked at the men huddled around his kitchen table. Decent, hard-working people who were willing to risk their lives for a man they'd known less than 6 months. Then he looked at his wife, whose faith in him had never wavered even when his own faith in himself had crumbled. My heart tells me that I've been running for too long, he said, and that maybe it's time to find out if Augustus Ironwood is worth the faith good people have placed in him. She smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since Dalton rode into town. Then we stay. We fight, and we trust that God has a plan for all of this. Outside, the church bells of Larkspur Ridge began to toll the hour, their bronze voices carrying across the desert night like a promise that some things, faith, community, love, were worth defending no matter what the cost. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and harder choices. But tonight, for the first time since Frank Dalton had shown him that wanted poster, Gus felt something that might have been hope. The dawn brought with it a revelation that Gus had never intended to share with anyone, least of all the woman he'd married. But as Patience sat across from him at their small breakfast table, her hands steady on her coffee cup despite the uncertainty of their situation, he found himself opening a door to his past that he'd kept locked for 15 years. There's something you need to know, he said, his voice carrying the weight of old grief, about why I became what I became. About the first woman I loved. Patience's eyes never left his face, but he saw her fingers tighten slightly around her. You don't owe me your secrets, Gus. We've all made peace with our pasts. This one matters, he said, rising to retrieve a small wooden box from the bedroom they shared. When he returned, he placed it on the table between them, with the reverence of a man handling something sacred, because it might help you understand why walking away isn't as simple as it should be. Inside the box, nestled in faded velvet, lay a delicate silver locket that had tarnished with age. The chain was broken, had been for 15 years, and the surface bore tiny dents that spoke of violence and loss. With careful fingers, he opened the clasp to reveal a photograph so small and faded that the features were barely visible. Her name was Catherine, he said, staring down at the ghostly image. Catherine Rose McKenna. She was everything good in a world that seemed determined to be cruel. We were going to be married, going to leave the territory and start fresh. Somewhere civilized. Patience reached across the table to cover his scarred hand with her smaller one. What happened to her? The memory came back with the sharp clarity that grief always preserved, every detail etched in his mind like words carved in stone. There was a man named Black Pete Morrison. called himself a gunfighter, but he was really just a killer who enjoyed hurting people. He'd heard about my reputation, wanted to make a name for himself by being the man who put down the Giant Cowboy. Gus closed the locket with a soft click, but kept it cradled in his palm. Pete couldn't beat me in a fair fight, so he took Catherine, used her as bait to draw me out, said he'd let her go if I met him in the street at high noon, like something out of a dime novel. "But you went anyway," Patience said, not a question, but a statement of certainty about the man she'd married. "Of course I went. I was young and stupid, and so in love I couldn't see past my own need to save her." His voice grew bitter with the memory of his own foolishness. Pete had positioned himself across from the saloon where he was holding Catherine. I could see her tied up on the second-floor balcony, could see the fear in her eyes. The silence stretched between them as Gus gathered the strength to continue. Outside, the sounds of Larkspur Ridge waking up, roosters crowing, doors opening, the everyday rhythms of a community going about its business, seemed to come from another world entirely. "I was faster than Pete Morrison," Gus said finally. "My bullet took him center mass before his cleared leather. But he'd planned for that possibility, had a man hidden in the saloon with orders to kill Catherine if anything happened to him." Patience's sharp intake of breath was the only sound. "In their small kitchen. I heard the shot before Pete even hit the ground. By the time I got upstairs, she was gone. The man who killed her had already fled through a back window. And Catherine—" He opened the locket again, as if the faded photograph could somehow bring her back. "She was wearing this when she died. The chain broke when they threw her body down to the street." "I'm so sorry, Gus," Patience whispered, her voice thick with empathy and pain. "For 15 years, I told myself that love was a weakness, that caring about someone just gave your enemies a weapon to use against you. I became harder, meaner, more dangerous. I figured if I was going to be alone, I might as well be the kind of alone that people feared." He looked up from the locket, to meet his wife's eyes, seeing understanding and sorrow reflected there, but no fear. "Never fear, not from Patience. When I met you, I thought I could have something different, something better. But now, with Dalton and his men out there, I can't help thinking that maybe I was wrong. Maybe loving someone just puts them in danger." Patience was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the intensity of someone memorizing details. Then she rose from her chair and moved to kneel beside him, her hands covering the one that held Catherine's locket. "Do you know what I see when I look at this?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "I see a man who loved someone so deeply that her loss nearly destroyed him. I see someone who knows the price of caring about another person and chose to pay it anyway." "Patience, I'm not Catherine," she said, cutting him off with quiet authority. "I'm not a helpless victim who needs to be protected from the world. I'm the daughter of a frontier preacher who's seen more violence and heartbreak than most women. My age. I know what I signed up for when I married you." She took the locket from his hands and studied the faded photograph with respectful attention. "She was beautiful," she said simply, "and she was lucky to be loved by you, even if that love couldn't save her." "I couldn't protect her," Gus said, the words carrying 15 years of guilt and self-recrimination. "You were one man against killers who had no honor," Patience replied. "But you're not that same man now, and this isn't that same situation. You have a community that's willing to stand with you. You have a wife who knows how to use her father's rifle and isn't afraid to do it. And you have something Catherine never had, time to prepare." She closed the locket and placed it gently back in the wooden box. "Keep her memory, Gus. Let it remind you why some things are worth fighting for. But don't let her death convince you that love is a weakness. Love is what's going to get us through this." A knock at their door interrupted the moment, and through the window they could see Reverend May standing on their porch, his usually cheerful expression grave with concern. "That'll be my father," Patience said, smoothing her skirts as she prepared to face whatever news he brought. "He probably wants to talk about what happened yesterday. Are you ready for that conversation?" Gus asked, knowing that Thomas would have strong opinions about his daughter being caught in the crossfire of his violent past. "I've been ready for it since the day I said, 'I do,'" she replied, moving toward the door with the same steady courage that had first drawn him to her dot. As she welcomed her father inside, Gus carefully returned Catherine's locket to its place in the wooden box. The past couldn't be changed, and the guilt would always be part of him. But Patience was right. This was a different situation, and he was a different man, Dot. The question was whether that would be enough when Frank Dalton came calling for his answer. Reverend Thomas May accepted the cup of coffee Patience offered him with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from age or anxiety was difficult to determine. At 63, Thomas had the weathered appearance of a man who'd spent his life ministering to frontier communities, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made him a respected voice in Larkspur Ridge for over 2 decades. "I won't pretend I'm not worried," he said without preamble, settling into the chair that Gus offered him at their small table. Margaret Henderson came by the parsonage before dawn, telling stories about wanted posters and bounty hunters, said there might be violence coming to our town. "She's not wrong," Gus admitted, taking his own seat across from the older man. "Though I'm hoping it doesn't come to that." Thomas studied him with the penetrating gaze of someone accustomed to reading the souls of troubled men. "From what Margaret described, you have options. This bounty hunter offered to take you quietly, without involving anyone else." "He did," Gus confirmed, feeling the weight of Patience's hand as she settled it on his shoulder. "The question is whether that's the right choice for everyone involved. And what does your conscience tell you?" The question caught Gus off guard. In all his years of violence and wandering, very few people had asked him about his conscience. Most assumed he didn't have one, or that it had been burned away by the heat of gunpowder and blood. "My conscience tells me that good people shouldn't have to suffer for my past mistakes," he said finally, "but it also tells me that running away might not solve the problem. Just push it down the road for someone else to deal with." Thomas nodded, thoughtfully, then surprised them both by reaching into his coat and producing something wrapped in soft cloth. When he unfolded the fabric, it revealed a small wooden cross, crudely carved but polished smooth by countless hands. "I've been carrying this for 20 years, Thomas said, placing the cross on the table between them. "Made it myself during my first winter in the territory when I was ministering to a mining camp up in the mountains. Hardest group of men I'd ever tried to preach to: killers, thieves, men who'd given up on redemption." He traced the simple lines of the cross with one finger, his expression distant with memory. "There was one fellow in particular, a gunfighter named Samuel Cross. Killed 17 men in fair fights, probably more in situations that weren't so fair. The other miners were terrified of him, but he kept coming to my Sunday services. Never said much, just sat in the back and listened." Patience leaned forward, intrigued by her father's story. "What happened to him?" "One night Sam came to see me. Said he was tired of being afraid all the time, afraid that every stranger might be faster than him, afraid that his past would catch up with him, afraid that he'd die without ever doing anything good with his life." Thomas picked up the cross, holding it up to catch the morning light. "He asked me if God could really forgive someone like him, if redemption was possible for a man with so much blood on his hands." "What did you tell him?" Gus asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "I told him the same thing I'm telling you now, that God's grace doesn't have limits, but accepting it means being willing to change, not just wanting to be different, but actually doing the hard work of becoming someone new." Thomas set the cross down and looked directly at Gus. "Sam stayed in that mining camp for 3 more years. Used his reputation to keep the peace instead of causing violence. Protected the weak, stood up to bullies, became the kind of man people looked up to instead of feared. When he finally moved on, the whole camp came to say goodbye." "What happened to him after that?" Patience asked. "Don't know for certain," Thomas admitted, "but I heard stories over the years about a former gunfighter turned lawman who cleaned up some of the worst towns in Colorado and Wyoming. Always suspected it was Sam, though he never used his real name again." Gus stared down at the simple wooden cross, seeing in its rough-hewn surface something of his own journey from violence to peace. "Why are you telling me this story, Thomas?" "Because I see the same look in your eyes that I saw in Sam's," the Reverend replied. "The look of a man who's tired of carrying the weight of his past. The difference is, you've already done something. Sam never had. You found someone who loves you enough to stand beside you no matter what comes." He reached across the table and placed his hand over Gus and Patience's joined ones. "My daughter didn't choose an easy path when she married you, but she chose it with her eyes wide open, and I've watched you both build something beautiful together these past months. Something worth protecting. But at what cost?" Gus asked. "If those men outside town decide to come in shooting, innocent people could die, children could be hurt. And if you ride away with that bounty hunter, what kind of message does that send to the next man who comes looking for you?" Thomas countered. "That the people of Larkspur Ridge can be intimidated? That threatening our community is an effective way to get what you want?" The logic was sound, but it didn't make the choice any easier. Gus had seen what happened when violence came to peaceful places, the way it lingered like smoke, changing people and poisoning the trust that held communities together. "There's something else you should know," Thomas said, lowering his voice as if what he was about to share was meant for their ears alone. "After Margaret spread the word about yesterday's visitor, I had more than a dozen families come to see me. They want to know what they can do to help." "Help how?" Patience asked. "Jim Carruthers organized a meeting for tonight at the church. They're calling it a town defense committee. Seems folks aren't as willing to let outsiders threaten their neighbors as some people might think." Gus felt a surge of emotion that he couldn't quite name. Gratitude mixed with humility and a deep, abiding amazement that people who barely knew him were willing to risk their safety for his sake. "Thomas, I can't ask people to put themselves in danger for me," he said. "You're not asking," the Reverend replied with a slight smile. "They're volunteering. There's a difference." He stood to leave, but paused to hand the wooden cross to Gus. "Keep this for now. Let it remind you that redemption isn't just about changing who you are. It's about becoming who you were meant to be. And sometimes that means standing your ground when running would be easier." After Thomas left, Gus sat, holding the cross and thinking about second chances, about the strange ways that grace could work in a man's life. Outside, the sounds of Larkspur Ridge continued. People going about their daily business, children playing in the streets, the rhythm of a community that had decided he belonged. "What are you thinking?" Patience asked, settling beside him on their small sofa. "I'm thinking," he said, closing his fingers around the wooden cross, "that maybe it's time to find out if the Giant Cowboy can learn to be something more than just a legend people tell stories about." The letter arrived with the afternoon mail, delivered by young Billy Morrison, with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped it twice before getting it to Gus's door. The envelope bore no return address, but the paper was expensive, the kind used by men who wanted their words to carry weight. Gus knew what it contained before he broke the wax seal. The handwriting was elegant, educated, the script of someone who'd learned penmanship in fancy Eastern schools, rather than around campfires and in frontier towns. "My dear brother Augustus, it has been far too long since we last spoke. I trust this letter finds you well and enjoying your new domestic arrangements. Yes, I know about the preacher's daughter. Word travels fast in our old circles, and your transformation from feared gunslinger to devoted husband has provided considerable entertainment in certain establishments. I quote am writing to inform you that our father's debts have finally come due. You remember father's debts, don't you, Augustus? The ones you helped create during those unfortunate years when we rode together. The Pemberton Railroad Company has not forgotten what happened to their payroll shipment outside Denver, nor have they forgotten who was responsible, I quote, LB in Larkspur Ridge within the week to settle this matter once and for all. I suggest you prepare accordingly. It would be unfortunate if your new neighbors suffered because of old family business. Your loving brother Mitchell. The letter fell from Gus's nerveless fingers like a leaf torn from a dying tree. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis, and he gripped the edge of their kitchen table to keep from staggering. "Gus?" Patience's voice came from somewhere far away, though she was standing right beside him. "What is it? Who's the letter from Mitchell?" he whispered, the name tasting like ashes in his mouth. "My brother Mitchell." The implications hit him like physical blows. Mitchell Ironwood, 3 years younger than Gus, twice as smart, and infinitely more dangerous because he combined natural talent with calculated cruelty. The brother he'd thought dead for 15 years, the one person alive who knew all his secrets and shared all his guilt. "I don't understand," Patience said, picking up the letter to read it herself. "I thought your family was all gone. You never mentioned having a brother." "Because I thought he was dead," Gus replied, sinking into a chair as the full weight of the situation settled on his shoulders. "We had a falling out years ago over a job that went bad. Last time I saw Mitchell, he was riding away from a burning ranch house with half the territorial militia chasing after him. I always assumed they caught up with him eventually, but they didn't. Apparently not." Gus took the letter back, reading it again in the desperate hope that he'd somehow misunderstood its contents. "The Pemberton job he mentions, we hit their payroll train outside Denver in 1862. $20,000 in gold and silver, meant to pay the railroad workers laying track through the mountains." Patience sat down across from him, her face pale but composed. "What went wrong?" "Mitchell got greedy. The plan was supposed to be simple: stop the train, take the payroll, let everyone go unharmed. But Mitchell had other ideas. Started shooting guards who were already surrendering, killed a couple of clerks who saw his face too clearly." The memories came flooding back, bitter and sharp as winter wind. "I tried to stop him, but by then it was too late. We had bodies on our hands instead of just a robbery." "Is that why you had your falling out?" "That and other things." Gus folded the letter carefully, as if treating it with respect might somehow lessen its threat. "Mitchell always had a mean streak, even as a boy. But after our parents died, it got worse. He started enjoying the violence, taking pleasure in other people's fear. I kept telling myself he'd grow out of it, that he was just young and angry about losing everything we'd ever known. But he didn't grow out of it. No, he didn't. And eventually I had to choose between my brother and my conscience." Gus looked out their window at the peaceful street beyond, where children were playing marbles in the dust and Mrs. Chen was hanging laundry on her line. "I chose conscience. Told Mitchell I was done with killing innocent people, that if he wanted to continue down that path, he'd have to do it without me. What did he do? Said some things I'd rather not repeat, then rode off into the night. That was the last time I saw him alive, at least the last time I thought I'd seen him alive." Patience reached across the table to take his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in the gesture of comfort that had become second nature to them both. "What do you think he wants now, after all these years?" Gus reread the letter one more time, trying to decipher the threat hidden beneath Mitchell's polite words. "Revenge, most likely. Mitchell never could stand being shown up by his older brother, and walking away from our partnership probably felt like the worst kind of betrayal to him. But he mentions debts, railroad company debts. That's the clever part," Gus said with grudging admiration for his brother's tactical thinking. "Mitchell always was smarter than me when it came to planning. If he's working for the Pemberton Railroad now, or at least claiming to be, then he's got legal backing for whatever he's planning to do. Makes him a representative of legitimate business interests instead of just another outlaw looking for revenge. You think he's actually working for them? Doesn't matter whether he is or not. What matters is that he's got a story that sounds reasonable to people who don't know him like I do." Gus stood and began pacing their small kitchen, his mind automatically shifting into the tactical thinking that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous situations. "Mitchell was always better at playing the long game than I was. If he wanted me dead, he could have just hired bounty hunters like Frank Dalton. The fact that he's coming himself, with all this talk about family business and railroad debts, means he's got something more elaborate in mind. Something that involves hurting innocent people, almost certainly. Gus stopped pacing and looked at his wife, seeing his own fear reflected in her green eyes. Mitchell won't just be content to kill me, Patience. He'll want to destroy everything I've built here first. Make me watch while he tears apart the life I've found with you. The sound of approaching footsteps on their porch interrupted his dark thoughts, and through the window they could see Frank Dalton walking up their front path with the casual confidence of a man who held all the winning cards. "Seems our bounty hunter friend has decided to pay us another visit," Gus observed. "What do you think he wants?" "Probably his answer. Sunset's still a few hours away, but maybe he's getting impatient." Gus moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. Or maybe Mitchell's arrival has changed the game in ways we don't understand yet. When he opened the door, Dalton was standing on their porch with a slight smile and a folded piece of paper in his hand. Another letter, this one bearing the same expensive stationery and elegant handwriting. "Afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Ironwood," Dalton said with mock courtesy. "Seems we have some new developments to discuss." The handwritten letter in Gus's kitchen suddenly felt less like a message from his past and more like the opening move in a game, where the stakes had just gotten much higher. Mitchell wasn't just coming for revenge, he was coming to settle old debts in the most public, devastating way possible. And somehow, Frank Dalton was part of the plan. Frank Dalton stepped into their home with the easy confidence of a man who knew he held the winning hand. But there was something different about him now, a familiarity in the way his eyes swept their modest furnishings, as if he'd been here before in his imagination. "Nice little place you've got here," he said, settling uninvited into the chair that Reverend May had occupied that morning. "Reminds me of the house our grandmother used to have up in Colorado. Same kind of simple, honest comfort." The words hit Gus like a physical blow, and suddenly everything, the pale grey eyes, the way Dalton held his head when he was thinking, the slight scar above his left eyebrow, fell into place with horrible clarity. "Mitchell," Gus breathed, the name escaping him like air from a punctured lung dot. Dalton's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect for a man who'd spent his life on the frontier. "Hello, big brother. It's been a long time." Patience's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room, as the implications of the revelation settled around them. The bounty hunter who'd been threatening their community for 2 days wasn't a stranger at all. He was family, the most dangerous kind of family, the kind that held grudges and had the skills to act on them. "You've changed," Gus said, studying the face he'd known since childhood, but somehow failed to recognize. Mitchell had always been the handsome one, blessed with their mother's fine features and their father's charm, but 15 years of hard living had carved new lines around his eyes and hardened his expression into something cruel. "We all change. Augustus, though I have to say yours is the most dramatic transformation I've seen, from the giant cowboy to a domesticated house cat, quite the evolution." Mitchell's gaze shifted to Patience, and the predatory interest in his eyes made Gus's hands clench involuntarily. "And this must be the lovely wife I've heard so much about, Mrs. Patience Ironwood, the preacher's daughter who tamed the legendary gunfighter." "Don't," Gus said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that had once made grown men back down in saloons from Denver to El Paso. "Don't what?" Mitchell asked with mock innocence. "Don't admire your wife's obvious charms. Don't wonder what kind of woman could convince the most feared killer in the territory to hang up his guns and play house." From his coat, Mitchell produced a silver compass, its surface worn smooth from years of handling. The sight of it hit Gus harder than the revelation of his brother's identity had, because he knew exactly what it meant and where it had come from. "Recognize this?" Mitchell asked, holding the compass up to catch the afternoon light streaming through their window. "It was Father's, The one thing of value he managed to hold on to after the bank took the ranch. Remember how he used to say it would help us find our way home no matter how far we wandered? Gus remembered. Their father had carried that compass. Through the Mexican War, had used it to navigate the cattle drives that kept their family fed during the lean years. It had been in their father's pocket when he died, and Gus had assumed it was buried with him. I took it before the funeral, Mitchell continued, as if reading his brother's thoughts. Figured one of us should keep the old man's memory alive, though I have to say it's been pointing in some interesting directions over the years. What do you want, Mitchell? Gus asked, though he suspected the answer would be more complicated than simple revenge. What do I want? Mitchell laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. I want what's owed to me, brother. 15 years of living, with the consequences of your sudden attack of conscience. 15 years of wondering what my life might have been like if my own blood hadn't abandoned me when things got difficult. He stood and began pacing their small living room, his movements restless and predatory. Do you know what it's like to have your older brother, the person you looked up to more than anyone in the world, tell you that you're not good enough for his moral standards? That you're too violent, too cruel, too far gone to deserve his loyalty? Mitchell, that's not what happened, isn't it? Mitchell spun to face him, and for a moment Gus saw a flash of the hurt, angry boy his brother had been after their parents died. You rode away from that ranch house and left me to face the militia alone. Left me to spend 3 years in territorial prison while you got to play the reformed gunfighter. You killed innocent people, Gus said quietly. I couldn't be part of that. Innocent people. Mitchell's voice dripped with contempt. Railroad clerks and security guards working for a company that was stealing land from farmers and ranchers all across Colorado. Men who knew exactly what kind of business they were in and what risks came with the job. They were surrendering. You shot them in cold blood. I shot them because they saw our faces and could identify us later. It was practical, Augustus, something you never seem to understand, that half measures get you killed in our line of work. Patience had been silent through this exchange, but now she spoke up, her voice steady despite the tension crackling through the room. And what about the Pemberton Railroad? Are you really working for them now? Mitchell's smile returned, sharp as a blade. Oh, that's the beautiful part of this whole arrangement. The Pemberton Railroad has been looking for the men who robbed their payroll train for 15 years. When I approached them with information about my brother's whereabouts, they were more than happy to issue me a legitimate bounty warrant. From his other pocket, he produced an official-looking document bearing an impressive seal and several signatures, fully authorized by the territorial government and backed by federal marshals. I'm not just Mitchell Ironwood seeking revenge on his brother. I'm a duly appointed agent of justice, bringing a wanted criminal to face the consequences of his crimes. Except that you were part of those crimes, Gus pointed out. Was I? According to the railroad's records, there was only one man they could positively identify from witness testimonies, a giant of a man with distinctive scars, known throughout the territory as the Giant Cowboy. His younger brother, if he existed at all, was just another nameless outlaw who disappeared into the wilderness. The scope of Mitchell's planning was becoming clear now, and Gus had to admire his brother's intelligence even as he despised his methods. Mitchell had spent 15 years building a new identity, one that positioned him as a legitimate agent of justice rather than an outlaw seeking revenge. So what's your play here? Gus asked. You've got your warrant. You've got your legal backing. Why not just take me in and collect your blood money? Because where's the poetry in that? Mitchell asked, settling back into his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who'd been waiting years to explain his masterpiece. No, I want you to suffer first. I want you to watch everything you've built here crumble. Your marriage, your reputation, your standing in this pathetic little community, all of it destroyed because the people you care about finally see you for what you really are. He leaned forward, his pale eyes fixed on Patience's face. Tell me, Mrs. Ironwood, how much do you really know about your husband's past? The details of all those men he killed, the families he destroyed, the towns he terrorized during his years as the Giant Cowboy. I know enough, Patience replied, her voice quiet but firm. Do you? Do you know about the widow he left in Abilene when he killed her husband over a card game? Do you know about the sheriff's deputy in Tombstone who had 3 young children? Do you know about the— Enough, Gus said, his voice cutting through his brother's litany like a blade dot. But Mitchell was just getting started. The people of Larkspur Ridge think they've welcomed a reformed sinner into their midst. Wait until they hear the specifics of exactly what kinds of sins need reforming. Wait until they understand that their new neighbor isn't just a former gunfighter. He's a killer of innocent men, a robber of widows and orphans, a man whose hands are so soaked in blood that no amount of prayer can wash them clean. The silver compass caught the light again as Mitchell turned it in his hands, and Gus realized that his brother hadn't just kept their father's compass as a memento. He'd kept it as a weapon, a way to wound him where it would hurt the most. I'm going to destroy everything you love, Augustus, Mitchell said with quiet satisfaction. And then, when you've lost everything that gives your life meaning, I'm going to kill you, slowly, painfully, and legally. The church had never felt so small. Every pew was packed with the people of Larkspur Ridge, their faces reflecting the full spectrum of human emotion, fear, determination, confusion, and something that might have been hope. The handmade quilt that the women's circle had presented to Gus and Patience as a wedding gift hung prominently behind the pulpit, its intricate patterns telling the story of a community that had come together to create something beautiful from individual pieces. Reverend May stood at the front of the sanctuary, his weathered hands gripping the edges of the lectern as he surveyed the crowd that had gathered in response to his call. It was the largest congregation he'd seen outside of Christmas and Easter, though the circumstances were far from celebratory. "Friends," Thomas began, his voice carrying the authority that came from decades of ministering to frontier communities. "We're gathered here tonight not for worship, but for decision. Our community faces a choice that will define who we are and what we stand for." Near the back of the church, Margaret Henderson sat with her husband Tom, her face pale but resolute. Beside them, Jim Carruthers and his son Pete had positioned themselves where they could watch the doors, their rifles resting across their knees with the casual readiness of men who decided that some things were worth fighting for. Gus sat in the front row with Patience, acutely aware of the weight of every gaze in the room. Some looked at him with the trust he'd spent months earning, others with the suspicion that Mitchell's revelations had rekindled. All of them were waiting to hear what he had to say about the choice they faced. "Before we discuss our options," Thomas continued, "I think it's important that everyone understands exactly what we're dealing with. Augustus, would you share what you've learned about your brother's intentions?" Gus rose slowly, feeling the familiar ache in his joints that came from a lifetime of hard living. At 6 feet and 6 inches, he towered over the assembled congregation. But for once, his size felt more like a burden than an advantage. These people deserved the truth, even if it cost him everything he'd built among them. "My brother Mitchell isn't just seeking revenge," he began, his voice carrying to the back of the church without strain. "He's planned this carefully, positioning himself as a legitimate agent of the Pemberton Railroad Company. In the eyes of territorial law, he has every right to be here." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Gus could see the implications registering on various faces. If Mitchell was operating with legal authority, then standing against him meant defying the law itself. "But legal doesn't mean right," Gus continued. "Mitchell killed innocent people during that railroad robbery 15 years ago. He's threatened this community and everyone in it because he wants to hurt me in the most devastating way possible. If we give him what he wants, if I surrender to him quietly, there's no guarantee he'll keep his word about leaving the rest of you alone. "What's the alternative?" asked Dr. Martin Webb, the town's physician and one of its most respected citizens. "You're talking about armed resistance against a legally authorized law enforcement action. That could bring federal marshals down on all of us." "It could," Gus admitted, "but consider the alternative. If we let Mitchell establish that threatening innocent people is an effective way to get what he wants, what happens the next time someone decides Larkspur Ridge looks like an easy target?" Patience stood beside her husband, and Gus felt her hand slip into his as she addressed the crowd. "I know some of you have doubts about the man I married. My father shared them when Gus first asked for my hand. But I've seen who he really is, not the legend people tell stories about, but the man who fixes your roofs and helps with your harvests and never asks for anything in return except the chance to belong somewhere." She paused, her green eyes sweeping the faces of people she'd known all her life. "Mitchell Ironwood wants to destroy that man, and he's willing to destroy our entire community to do it. The question isn't whether Gus deserves our help. It's whether we're the kind of people who abandon our neighbors when they need us most." Old Pete Carruthers, who'd been one of the first to openly accept Gus's presence in town, struggled to his feet with the aid of his walking stick. "I've lived in Larkspur Ridge for 30 years, he said, his voice quavering with age but firm with conviction. "Seen it grow from a collection of tents and adobe huts to the community we have today. Built it with people who understood that out here you look after your neighbors because nobody else will." He gestured toward Gus with his walking stick. "This man could have ridden through our town and kept going, could have found his peace somewhere else. Instead, he stayed, married one of our daughters, became part of what we're building here. Far as I'm concerned, that makes him family." "But what about the cost?" Margaret Henderson asked, her voice tight with worry. "What about our children? What about the people who'll get hurt if this turns into a shooting war?" It was young Billy Morrison who answered her, the boy who'd been too nervous to speak to Gus just a week earlier. "Mrs. Henderson, my PA always said that sometimes the cost of not fighting is higher than the cost of fighting. If we let bad men scare us into abandoning good ones, what kind of place are we making for our children to grow up in?" The debate continued for another hour, with voices raised on both sides of the question. Some argued for caution, for finding a way to negotiate with Mitchell that wouldn't require bloodshed. Others insisted that men like Mitchell Ironwood only understood strength, and that showing weakness would invite future predators to see Larkspur Ridge as easy prey. Throughout it all, Gus found himself studying the quilt behind the pulpit, remembering the Sunday afternoon when the women of the community had presented it to him and Patience. Each square had been sewn by different hands. Sarah Chen's intricate star pattern, Margaret Henderson's careful geometric designs, old Mrs. Carruthers' traditional log cabin blocks. Individually, the pieces were beautiful, but unremarkable. Together, they formed something stronger and more meaningful than the sum of their parts. When the debate finally died down, Thomas May called for a decision. "All in favor of standing with the Ironwoods and defending our community against outside threats, please stand." The response was not unanimous, but it was decisive. More than 2/3 of the congregation rose to their feet, including some who'd been vocal in their concerns about the risks involved. Margaret Henderson was among them, her face set with the determination of a woman who'd weighed the costs and found them acceptable. "Then it's settled," Thomas said with satisfaction. "We stand together." The next several hours were spent in preparation that felt surreal in its domesticity. Jim Carruthers organized the men into defensive positions around the town's perimeter, while the women gathered supplies and prepared the church basement as a medical station. Children were sent to stay with families who lived furthest from the center of town, and the older boys were given responsibilities that made them feel important while keeping them away from potential danger. Gus found himself in the strange position of advising on defensive strategies against an attack he desperately hoped wouldn't come. His brother was many things, but he wasn't stupid. Mitchell would have anticipated the possibility of community resistance, and he'd have planned accordingly. "How many men do you think he brought with him?" Tom Henderson asked as they positioned furniture to create improvised barricades. "Hard to say," Gus replied, checking the sight lines from the general store's second-story window. Mitchell always preferred working with small groups. Easier to control, fewer people to share the profits with. But if he's serious about this being a legal operation, he might have convinced some legitimate lawman to join his cause. What's his most likely approach? Gus studied the layout of Larkspur Ridge's main street, trying to think like his brother. Mitchell's patient. He won't come charging in like some wild cowboy. He'll try to isolate me, force a confrontation where he has every advantage. As if summoned by their conversation, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the setting sun. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking Mitchell's distinctive silhouette or the arrogant way he sat his horse. "Looks like he's ready to make his move," Tom observed. But as the rider drew closer, it became apparent that this wasn't Mitchell at all, but a stranger, a young man wearing a deputy's badge and carrying a white flag of truce. "And Mr. Ironwood," the deputy called out when he was within speaking distance. "I'm Deputy Marshal James Crawford, acting on behalf of the territorial government. I have a message from Mr. Mitchell Ironwood, duly authorized representative of the Pemberton Railroad Company." Gus stepped out from behind his defensive position, keeping his hands visible but ready. "I'm listening." "Mr. Mitchell Ironwood requests a meeting to discuss terms for a peaceful resolution to this matter. He's prepared to guarantee safe passage for all civilians and minimal disruption to your community if you'll agree to surrender yourself voluntarily. And if I refuse," the deputy's face was grim, "then he's authorized to use whatever forces necessary to apprehend you, and the territorial government will not be held responsible for collateral damage to persons or property." Gus looked back at the people who'd chosen to stand with him, neighbors who'd risked their lives and livelihoods because they believed he was worth fighting for. The handmade quilt in the church window caught the last rays of sunlight, its patterns seeming to glow with the warmth of the hands that had created it. "Tell my brother," Gus said finally, "that if he wants to settle our family business, he can do it face to face. But he does it here, in front of witnesses, and he does it fair." The deputy nodded and wheeled his horse around, galloping back toward Mitchell's camp as darkness began to settle over Larkspur Ridge. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that 15 years of separation had been building toward Dot, and Gus could only hope that the community that had become his family would still be standing when it was over. Dawn came with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the desert air seem fragile, as if the wrong sound might shatter the morning into 1,000 glittering pieces. Gus stood on the main street of Larkspur Ridge, his father's pocket watch, heavy in his vest pocket, its familiar weight a reminder of the man he'd once tried to be and the man he was determined to become. Dot, the watch, had been a gift on his 18th birthday. Engraved with words their father had spoken countless times during Gus's childhood. A man's character isn't measured by his mistakes, but by how he chooses to answer for them. At the time, Gus had thought it was just another piece of frontier, wisdom. Now, 34 years later, he understood it as prophecy. Mitchell rode into town with the sunrise at his back, flanked by 4 men who carried themselves with the professional competence of experienced lawmen. Deputy Marshal Crawford was among them, his young face set with the grim determination of someone who'd spent a sleepless night contemplating the violence that might come with the morning light. But it was Mitchell who commanded attention, sitting, his horse with the easy confidence that had always made him seem larger than his actual size. He'd changed clothes since their confrontation the previous day, trading his dusty traveling gear for a crisp white shirt and black vest that made him look like a successful businessman rather than an outlaw seeking revenge. "Good morning, Augustus," Mitchell called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Beautiful day for settling old debts, don't you think?" Gus stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden boardwalk that ran along the front of Henderson's general store. Behind him, he could feel the presence of the people who'd chosen to stand with him. Tom Henderson, with his hunting rifle. Jim Carruthers positioned at the blacksmith shop with a clear field of fire. Pete Carruthers watching from the church bell tower with his father's old army carbine. "Mitchell," Gus replied, his hand resting casually near the Colt .45 he'd retrieved from its hiding place that morning. The gun felt strange on his hip after months of peaceful living, but the muscle memory of 3 decades hadn't faded. "I see you brought friends." "Associates," Mitchell corrected with a slight smile. "Deputy Marshal Crawford you've already met. The others are federal marshals here to ensure that justice is served according to territorial law." One of the marshals, a heavy-set man with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life enforcing law on the frontier, urged his horse forward. "Augustus Ironwood, by the authority vested in me by the territorial government, you are under arrest for robbery, murder, and various other crimes committed against the Pemberton Railroad Company. Will you surrender peaceably?" "That depends," Gus said, his eyes never leaving Mitchell's face, "on whether your associate there plans to honor the terms of a fair arrest or if he's got something more permanent in mind." The marshal's expression darkened with confusion. "I'm not sure I understand your meaning, Mr. Ironwood." "Ask him about the Pemberton job," Gus suggested. "Ask him who else was there that day, who else pulled triggers and spilled innocent blood. Ask him why his testimony is the only evidence the railroad has against me." Mitchell's smile widened, revealing teeth that gleamed white in the morning sun. "My brother seems to be under the impression that dragging up old accusations will somehow change the facts of his situation. Augustus, you're wanted for crimes that have been thoroughly documented and witnessed. The time for denying responsibility is long past." But Gus could see uncertainty flickering in the marshal's eyes, the first seeds of doubt about the case he'd been asked to pursue. Good lawmen developed instincts for recognizing when they weren't getting the whole story, and something about Mitchell's smooth explanations was setting off warning bells. "Marshal," came a new voice from behind Gus, and he turned to see Reverend May approaching with measured steps. The older man carried himself with the quiet dignity that came from decades of counseling troubled souls, and his presence seemed to change the tenor of the confrontation. "Before any arrests are made, perhaps we should discuss the unusual circumstances surrounding this case." "What circumstances?" the marshal asked. Thomas gestured toward Mitchell with the same calm authority he used when delivering sermons. "The fact that the primary witness against Augustus Ironwood is his own brother, a man who by his own admission was present at the crimes in question. The fact that this same brother has spent considerable time and money tracking down a man who, by all accounts, has been living peacefully as a law-abiding citizen for months." Mitchell's expression hardened, the polite mask slipping to reveal something colder underneath. "Reverend, I'd hate to see a man of God caught up in something that doesn't concern him." "But it does concern me," Thomas replied evenly. "Augustus is my son-in-law, and this community has voted to stand with him. We have serious questions about the motivations behind these charges." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with each man calculating angles and advantages while trying to read the intentions of the others. Gus could feel the weight of his father's watch, could almost hear the old man's voice reminding him that character was measured not by past mistakes, but by present choices. "I'll come with you," Gus said finally, the words carrying clearly in the morning air. "But I want guarantees about the safety of these people, and I want a fair trial, with all the evidence presented, not just the convenient parts." Mitchell's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Oh, Augustus, you always were too trusting for your own good." His hand moved toward his gun, with the fluid speed that had made the Ironwood brothers legendary throughout the territory. But Gus had been watching for exactly that movement, and his own draw was already in motion when he saw Mitchell's shoulders. Dense dot, the first shot shattered the crystalline morning air like thunder. The sound of Mitchell's bullet splintering the wooden post behind Gus's left shoulder was immediately followed by the sharp crack of return fire from the church bell tower, where Pete Carruthers had been watching the confrontation unfold through. His rifle sight, one of Mitchell's supposed federal marshals, a lean man with the cold eyes of a hired killer rather than a lawman, tumbled from his saddle with a cry of pain and surprise. "Federal marshals, my eye!" Jim Carruthers shouted from his position at the blacksmith shop. "Real marshals don't draw iron on unarmed civilians." The street exploded into chaos as the careful facade of legal authority crumbled under the reality of Mitchell's true intentions. Deputy Marshal Crawford, caught between conflicting loyalties and confused by the sudden violence, tried to maintain some semblance of official procedure even as bullets began flying around him. "Stand down!" Crawford shouted, his voice cracking with youth and stress. "Everyone stand down!" But Mitchell was beyond hearing reasonable commands now, his face twisted with 15 years of accumulated rage and resentment as he spurred his horse toward the boardwalk where Gus stood. "You should have stayed dead to me, Augustus," he screamed over the gunfire. "Should have kept running instead of playing house with your preacher's daughter." Gus threw himself sideways as Mitchell's horse thundered past, the animal's hooves striking sparks from the wooden planks where he'd been standing moments before. His roll brought him up behind a water trough, and he could hear Mitchell's voice rising above the din of battle with the kind of unhinged fury that came from a man finally releasing years of suppressed hatred, the broken chain that had once bound. Gus's holster to his gunbelt lay in pieces on the boardwalk, severed by Mitchell's first shot. For 30 years, that chain had been a symbol of the life he'd chosen. Quick draws, faster kills, and the kind of reputation that made lesser men step aside. Now, it lay broken, and somehow that felt like the final severing of ties to the man. "He used to be. You took everything from me," Mitchell continued, wheeling his horse around for another pass. "Our partnership, our future, our father's respect, all of it gone because you decided to grow a conscience. I saved your life," Gussie shouted back, rising from behind the trough to snap off 2 quick shots that sent Mitchell's horse rearing. "That ranch house was surrounded by militia. If I hadn't gotten you out, you left me." The words came out as a howl of pain that had been 15 years in the building. "You left me to rot in territorial prison while you got to be the reformed outlaw, the man who found redemption." One of the real federal marshals, the silver-haired veteran who'd been asking uncomfortable questions, had taken cover behind the post office and was trying to make sense of the situation. "Crawford!" he yelled to the young deputy. "What the hell is going on here?" "I don't know, Marshal Pike," Crawford replied from his position behind an overturned wagon. "Mitchell Ironwood said he had legitimate warrants, but these men with him aren't acting like federal agents." The truth was becoming clear to anyone with eyes to see. Mitchell's associates were fighting with the desperate viciousness of hired guns rather than the disciplined restraint of professional lawmen. One of them had taken a position on the roof of the boarding house and was systematically trying to pick off the townspeople who'd taken defensive positions, showing no regard for the civilian status that should have protected them. Patience appeared at the window of Henderson's general store, Tom Henderson's hunting rifle in her capable hands. She'd spent enough time helping her father hunt for the family table to know how to handle a long gun, and her first shot sent the man on the boarding house roof scrambling for better cover. "Behind you, Gus," she called out, and he spun just in time to see one of Mitchell's men trying to flank him through the alley between buildings. The confrontation that followed was brief and brutal. The hired gun was fast, but he was facing a man who'd survived 3 decades of violent encounters through a combination of skill, experience, and the kind of desperate determination that came from having something worth protecting. When the smoke cleared, Gus was still standing, though a bullet had creased his left arm and blood was seeping through his shirt sleeve. Mitchell saw his man fall and let out a roar of frustrated rage. "You always were lucky, weren't you, Augustus? Always managed to come out on top no matter how bad the odds looked." "It was never about luck, Mitchell," Gus replied, advancing toward his brother with deliberate steps. It was about choosing to be better than the worst thing I'd ever done. Better. Mitchell's laugh was bitter as alkali water. You think marrying some backwater preacher's daughter makes you better than me? You think playing house in this pathetic little town erases all the blood on your hands? The broken chain at Gus's feet caught the morning light, its severed links scattered like the remnants of his old life. He stepped over them without looking down, moving toward the final confrontation that 15 years of separation had made. Inevitable. No, he said quietly, his voice carrying despite the continued gunfire around them. But it makes me someone worth fighting for. 6 months later, the new church bell rang out across Larkspur Ridge with a voice as clear and strong as hope itself. Cast from bronze donated by Augustus and Patience Ironwood, it bore no inscription save for the date it was hung and the simple words, "In memory of redemption found." The bell replaced the one that had been damaged during what the territorial newspapers had called the Larkspur Ridge incident, though the people who lived through it had settled on calling it simply the day Mitchell came home. The original bell had been cracked by a stray bullet during the final moments of the confrontation, when Mitchell Ironwood finally faced the choice between surrender and a death that would accomplish nothing but the satisfaction of his own hatred. He had chosen surrender, though it came only after Gus had put 3 bullets in his gun arm and Marshal Pike had placed him under arrest for impersonating a federal officer, conspiracy, and attempted murder. The hired guns Mitchell had brought with him were either dead or in territorial custody, and Deputy Marshal Crawford had filed a report that painted a clear picture of a revenge scheme disguised as legitimate law enforcement. Gus stood in the shadow of the church now, watching his wife direct the final preparations for the community social that would celebrate both the new bell and the first anniversary of their wedding. Patience moved among the gathered townspeople with the easy confidence of someone who had found her place in the world, her laughter mixing with the voices of children playing and the gentle conversation of neighbors who had become family. The scar on his left arm had healed clean, leaving only a thin white line to mark where Mitchell's bullet had found its target. It was the newest addition to a collection of scars that told the story of his violent years, but somehow it felt different from the others, not a mark of shame, but a reminder of what he'd been willing to fight for when it mattered most. Penny. For your thoughts, Thomas May said, approaching with the careful steps of a man whose arthritis was acting up, but whose spirit remained undaunted. Just thinking about how much has changed, Gus replied, accepting the glass of lemonade that Thomas offered. A year ago, I was sleeping under the stars more often than not, taking whatever jobs would keep me moving. Now look at this. He gestured toward the gathering, where Tom Henderson was helping Jim Carruthers set up tables for the feast that would follow the bell dedication. Margaret Henderson was organizing the women in arranging flowers and food, her earlier suspicions of Gus replaced by the warm acceptance that came from having fought beside someone when it mattered. Change isn't always comfortable, Thomas observed, settling onto the bench beside Gus with a slight groan. But it's usually necessary. You've become the man my daughter saw in you from the beginning, even when you couldn't see it yourself. Young. Billy Morrison ran past them, chasing his younger sister in a game of tag that involved considerable squealing and laughter. The boy had grown 3 inches since Gus first arrived in Larkspur Ridge, and his initial fear of the Giant Cowboy had been replaced by the kind of hero worship that made Gus both proud and deeply humbled. Any word on Mitchell's trial? Thomas asked. Should be starting next month in Santa Fe, Gus replied. Marshal Pike says the territorial prosecutor is confident of conviction on multiple charges. Even with good behavior, Mitchell's looking at 10 to 15 years in prison. How do you feel about that? It was the kind of question that Thomas specialized in, simple words that carried the weight of deeper moral considerations. Gus had been wrestling with his feelings about his brother's fate since the day Mitchell was led away in shackles. still cursing Gus's name and promising revenge that would never come. Sad, mostly, Gus said finally. Mitchell chose his path, and he'll have to live with the consequences. But he's still my brother, and there's a part of me that wishes things could have been different. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the harm someone has caused, Thomas said gently. It means choosing not to let that harm define who you become. The new church bell began to toll, calling the community together for the dedication ceremony. As Gus and Thomas walked toward the gathering crowd, Gus found himself thinking about the bronze that had been melted down and reformed to create something beautiful and useful, not unlike his own transformation from feared gunfighter to beloved. Neighbor Patience was waiting for them at the front of the church, wearing the blue dress she'd married him in, and holding the small wooden cross that Thomas had given Gus during those uncertain days when Mitchell's threat still loomed over their future. She'd asked to carry it during the ceremony, saying it represented not just Gus's redemption, but the community's faith in the possibility of change. "Ready?" she asked, slipping her arm through his. "More than ready," he replied, feeling the solid weight of his father's pocket watch against his chest, and the lighter weight of his wedding ring on his finger. As the ceremony began and the voices of Larkspur Ridge rose in hymns of gratitude and hope, Gus reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. The Giant Cowboy was still part of him, would always be part of him, but he was no longer defined by that legend. He had become something more, a husband, a neighbor, a man whose past had been transformed by love into something that could serve. The future. The new bell continued to ring, its voice carrying across the desert to places where other lost souls might hear it and wonder if redemption was possible for them as well. And Augustus Ironwood, formerly known as the Giant Cowboy, stood with his wife and his community and knew that some transformations were worth fighting for, no matter what they cost. The bronze bell sang of new beginnings, and its song was answered by the laughter of children who would grow up in a town where even dangerous men could learn to be gentle, where even the most feared legends could become the most beloved neighbors. Some stories ended with violence and tragedy. This one ended with hope.